Welcome back. Last time we talked about the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther, the 95 Theses. We're going to continue with the Reformation here and talk about John Calvin for a few moments. Second to Martin Luther in influence, certainly. Calvin lived from 1509 to 1564. He sort of represents a younger generation, sort of an heir or beneficiary of the earlier work done by Luther. He represents kind of a consolidation of this Reformed movement, or this tradition to reform the church. He studied theology in Paris. He begins to have doubts about the confession and the role of the priest. In 1533, he breaks with the Catholic Church. And just earlier, he had published commentaries that had challenged the church, shall we say. And we have to put this in a little bit of context. King Francis I of France is disturbed by the rising number of Protestants in Catholic France. So the government begins to oppress Protestants. As a result, Calvin flees to Switzerland. There in 1536, he publishes one of the founding documents of the Reformation. It's called the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and you can Google that and take a look at it if you'd like. In Geneva, in Switzerland, Calvin establishes a city-state, and it's kind of a strict regime over the religious life of the people of Geneva. This city-state has a heavy emphasis on public morality, things that you should not do, open expression of joy, dancing, singing. These are bad signs that you may be affiliated with Satan. Citizens could be executed for saying the Pope was a good man. So you can see that this Calvinist ideology takes itself very seriously. There is no room for dissent. So let's look at Calvinism in a little more detail. Calvinism argues for the absolute sovereignty of God. God precedes Scripture, and He is sovereign over all. Calvinism argues for the radical depravity of man. That bridgeable gap in Catholicism between man and God, not so much in Calvinism. Man is too depraved to have any link to God at all. A new edition of the Institutes in 1539 kind of establishes an intellectual and theological foundation for the Reformation. The Institutes, they reflect on the Ten Commandments, on the Lord's Prayer, on the Apostles' Creed, and other aspects of Catholic dogma. I heard one historian talk about an acronym to help you remember the sort of central tenets of Calvinism. The acronym is TULIP, like the flower. The T stands for total depravity. Man has no way, no chance of meriting any sort of redemption. The U from TULIP, unconditional election. God chooses people for salvation, and your behavior has nothing to do with it. The L in TULIP, limited atonement. For whom did Christ die? Good question. The I in TULIP, irresistible grace for the elect. Again, no claim to merit. Grace is not a reward for conduct. It is strictly God's choice, as He is the ultimate sovereign. And then the P in TULIP, persistence in grace. Grace can't be lost or rejected by those elected by God. Now, who are these elect that Calvin talks about? This gets into some deep theological waters here. It brings up the problem of an omniscient and omnipotent God. If God knows everything, if He knows your fate, has He willed it? Is it God's choice and not yours? What happens to free will here? And of course, free will has always been central to Christian theology because it helps explain the existence of evil. If God is omniscient, if God is omnipotent, then how do we explain the existence of evil here on earth? the traditional Christian explanation is that God gave man free will so that he could commit sin or could do good works. And of course, this notion of the elect is troubling also because it hints at what we might call predestination. God's already made this decision. He already knows who is to be saved and who isn't. So these are difficult theological questions. Of course, the old Catholic doctrine said that humans had free will and that God knew the outcome. He knew the outcome, but he didn't impose it. So you can see the difference here. Let's continue with Calvin a little bit more. I'm going to sum up some basic ideas here. All people are predestined to salvation or to damnation. What we do is irrelevant. All is decided by God. God's sovereignty is so absolute that humans can have no impact on their fate. So why not eat, drink, and be merry? Why not do what we want since God's already decided? Well, according to Calvin, to fight off the possibility of hedonism, of unrestrained behavior, Calvin talks about the signs of election, those outward symbols that you are among God's elect. No one can know for sure if they're among the elect. So public professions of faith would indicate that you might be. Regular church attendance, leading a godly life, all these things point to the fact that you should be, if not, you should be among the elect. All these may be a sign of God's grace. So these habits, these godly habits produced a certain uniformity of behavior. Everyone wants to appear to be one of the elect. Now, Luther and Calvin agreed on the primacy of Scripture, on justification by faith and not works, and that free will is pointless because for humans, because of the bondage of original sin. There are differences. Luther did not accept that grace was persistent and irresistible. Luther and Calvin also disagreed on the certitude of salvation. Luther does not hold for absolute predestination. And there are other differences between the two, but I don't want to get into too much detail here. So in the end, we place John Calvin in the larger context of the Reformation, and his significance lies in creating this powerful theological foundation for certain sects of the Reformers, especially the Calvinists, that will be in northern Europe. We get varieties of them in England and Scotland and in Germany and in France. And then later, of course, we'll have the Puritans. When they go to Plymouth Colony in the early 17th century, that's the Calvinist theology that they take with them. Some of you may have had a chance to read Jonathan Edwards, the famous Puritan divine, and his sermons about the depravity of man and how God's holding us like a spider over the pit of hell. Really chilling stuff to read, but it gives you a nice insight into the Calvinist view of the relationship between God and man. So I'm going to stop there with Calvin. Next time we'll talk about the Counter-Reformation. Thank you.